My name is Emily Sterling. I'm 34 years old, and I've spent my whole life being told I was the failure of my family. At my dad's 65th birthday dinner, I sat in silence as my brother Michael stood up and called me a burden, a disappointment right in front of everyone. Then, when it came time to exchange gifts, I handed him a small teal box. He sneered, called it trash, and threw it aside. At that moment, I felt the same humiliation I'd carried for years until I picked it back up. What was inside that box didn't just silence the room, it changed everything. So tell me, what do you think happened when I finally opened it? I remember the way I felt swallowed up by the glittering sea of people inside my father's Dallas estate on the night of his 65th birthday. Laughter floated like champagne bubbles, glasses clinked together in endless toasts, and the smooth hum of a jazz trio rolled through the air. Crystal chandeliers showered the long banquet table with a golden glow, making every lobster tail glisten and every cut of steak look like art. Everything around me spoke of perfection, of a life crafted with care and wealth. Yet I sat tucked into the corner of the great room, trying to make myself invisible, my heart heavy with a silence no one else could hear. My father, Richard Sterling, stood at the center of it all. Tall and still handsome despite his age, he carried his tuxedo like a second skin. His smile was the kind people trusted instantly, a smile that had built a real estate empire and kept friends loyal for decades. Around him, relatives leaned close to flatter him, old colleagues slapped his back, and neighbors admired the man who had seemed to conquer everything he touched. I watched him with complicated eyes. He deserved the admiration, I knew that. But in the same breath, I also knew that in the story everyone told about our family, there was only one true star. And it wasn't me. The door swung open with a sudden sweep as if on cue. A hush fell over the crowd, a pause that was almost theatrical. My brother Michael Sterling strode in with his wife Karen. At 39, Michael had grown into the man everyone expected him to be. Tall, broad-shouldered, with tailored confidence stitched into every seam of his charcoal suit. Karen glittered beside him, her sequined gown hugging her figure, her blonde hair set in perfect waves, her smile radiant. They looked like a magazine spread, and the room responded with applause, cheers, and words of awe. Michael Sterling, the pride of the Sterling family. Someone near me said it out loud, as if the thought itself could not be contained. Michael is the one who makes this family proud. Look at his career. Look at the deals he closes. Soon he will be running Richard's company entirely. Another voice chimed in dripping admiration. Every word sliced me open with a quiet, familiar ache. I had lived my whole life inside the shadow of those compliments. Michael's brilliance, Michael's ambition, Michael's victories, and me, Emily, 34, the afterthought. The quiet daughter who painted when she was young, who read too much, who blended into wallpaper at parties like this. I curled my fingers around the stem of my glass knuckles, white as if holding tight to something could stop the slow drain of energy from my body. I thought back to when we were children running down tree-lined streets in Austin. Even then, Michael had shone brighter. He was the boy who won spelling bees and basketball tournaments, who had teachers singing his praises. I was the girl with sketchbooks no one flipped through, with essays that earned good grades, but no applause. I tried so hard to be noticed, but it was like reaching for sunlight through the canopy of a giant oak. My leaves never seemed to matter. Michael's voice snapped me out of my reverie. He was already holding court across the room, speaking with a booming confidence that filled the space. I caught snippets of billion-dollar projects, mergers, and acquisitions. His laugh was sharp, practiced the kind of sound that made people lean closer to be part of his world. Then his eyes found mine. For a moment, the noise around us blurred. His lips curved into that familiar smirk, the one that had haunted me since childhood. He didn't need words. That look, that tiny curl of his mouth said it all. You haven't changed. You're still nothing. My chest tightened a weight pressing down on my ribs, as if the air itself had turned to ice. My pulse hammered in my ears, too loud, too fast. I wanted to stand, to scream, to throw my glass against the floor. Instead, I sat frozen in my chair, swallowing back the hot sting of tears. The night should have been a celebration of my father's life, but for me it became a mirror reflecting every wound I had carried for decades. The chandelier's light blurred as tears pricked the corners of my eyes. I blinked them back, refusing to let them fall. The laughter around me seemed harsher now, like knives scraping across glass. Each cheer for Michael pressed deeper into my chest, an invisible hand tightening around my throat. I could almost hear the echo of my younger self whispering, "Why not me? Why was I never enough?" Later, when the applause for Michael still echoed in the high ceilings, I let my mind slip away from the glitter and laughter to a different time and place, to a year that had branded me with a scar I still carried. It was 2006, and back then I had believed that if I worked hard enough, someone in this family might finally see me. The sound of glasses clinking and voices cheering for Michael Sterling faded from my ears, as if someone had slowly turned down the volume of the world around me. I sat perfectly still in that grand Dallas estate, but inside my chest something old and raw was stirring. I had been here before, not in this room, but in this place of invisibility, of being treated as if my existence was secondary. Sitting there in the glitter of chandeliers, my mind slipped back to 2006, to a summer that left me branded with a scar I still carried. I was 25 years old, standing in the living room of our family home in Austin with a letter in my hand that should have changed everything. The air had been thick with heat, the heavy Texas sun pressing down until even the oak trees seemed to groan. I remember gripping that letter so tightly the edges bent under my fingers. My heart raced, my palms were damp, but my spirit soared. After months of exhausting work, sleepless nights, and relentless hope, I had been awarded a full scholarship to the University of Texas at Austin, one of the most prestigious programs in the state. It was the chance I had prayed for, the doorway to a future I had built with my own determination. I walked into the kitchen where my father, Richard Sterling, sat reading the paper. His glasses rested low on his nose, his eyes buried in the financial section. I placed the letter before him, my voice trembling with both pride and disbelief. "Dad, I got it. I got the scholarship." For one heartbeat, I let myself believe his face would soften, that his pride would shine on me the way it always did on Michael. But he barely glanced at the page. No smile, no spark of recognition. He folded the letter with an air of finality, set it aside, and called for my brother. Michael appeared with his easy stride, shoulders relaxed, every movement stitched with confidence. I stood frozen as my father's voice filled the kitchen, low and commanding. "Son, this program is excellent. It will set you up for a powerful career. I have already made arrangements for you." My chest constricted so sharply it felt as though the air had abandoned me. "Dad." I whispered the words, scraping against my throat. "But that's mine. That scholarship is mine." He looked at me then, but not with pride or joy. His gaze was cool, steady, almost clinical. "Emily, you understand. Michael must take this opportunity. It is important for our family's reputation." Reputation. Family pride. Words that landed like stones in the pit of my stomach. At that moment, I was not a daughter who had earned something extraordinary. I was a placeholder, a name to erase when it suited them. Michael simply nodded and accepted, his face unreadable, his silence complicated. No apology, no hesitation, just quiet entitlement. In the corner of the kitchen stood my mother, Helen Sterling. Her hands were clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone white. She didn't speak. When my eyes sought hers, begging for anyone to stand beside me, her gaze dropped to the floor. Her silence cut deeper than words ever could. That night I cried until my pillow was soaked, the sound of my own sobs muffled into the dark. My chest ached from the force of it. I kept asking myself the same questions over and over. Why was Michael always chosen? Why was I always the one asked to step aside, to sacrifice, to disappear? I had worked just as hard, maybe harder. Yet my efforts seemed to vanish like smoke, never solid enough to matter. By morning, Michael had left early with my father to tour the campus. From the upstairs window, I watched them walk side by side in the bright Texas sun, my father's hand clapping proudly against Michael's back. Their silhouettes stretched long and certain, while mine was nowhere to be found. The house felt emptier than ever, not because they had left, but because I understood with crushing clarity that I had no place in their vision of the future. That scholarship had been more than a piece of paper. It had been proof that I was capable, that I had value. And when it was taken from me, it wasn't just an opportunity that disappeared, it was my right to be seen as equal. That wound never healed. It hardened, calcified, into something I carried into every family gathering, every polite smile, every look Michael threw my way. Years later at my father's birthday dinner, the applause for Michael still echoing under chandeliers, I could feel that old scar throb as though it had been carved only yesterday. I had learned to bury the pain deep, to smile quietly, to speak softly, so as not to disrupt the story everyone else wanted to believe. But memories have claws, and that one still reached for me, dragging me back to the moment I was erased. As the glasses clinked and laughter swirled around me in Dallas, I tasted the metallic bitterness of 2006 on my tongue. My heart beat a vow into the silence no one else could hear. I will not be that invisible girl anymore. The golden lights from the chandeliers flickered across the polished champagne glasses, making the entire banquet hall shimmer like a stage set for a play. My pulse quickened when I saw Michael Sterling rise from his chair, a glass of wine in his hand, his posture effortless, commanding. A hush rippled through the room, as if everyone knew he was about to deliver one of his celebrated speeches. My chest tightened. Every time Michael spoke at these gatherings, his words carried the same sweetness laced with poison. I braced myself, knowing deep down he would not resist the chance to aim that poison at me. His voice cut through the music and chatter, steady and self-assured. Tonight we are here to celebrate our family, to honor my father and all he has built. He paused, letting the room lean into his words, then let his eyes sweep across the crowd before locking on me. I would also like to mention someone very special. Emily, my sister. She has always been a challenge. Laughter rippled around the table, sharp and knowing. Some of the guests smirked, already familiar with the caricatures Michael had painted of me over the years, stories twisted to make me the family's comic relief, the one they could dismiss without thought. My throat constricted as if the air had thickened, but I forced myself to remain still, my face a mask. For a moment, I clung to the fragile hope that maybe this time would be different. It wasn't. Michael leaned casually against the back of his chair, his smile curling with triumph. Let's be honest. Emily has always been a disappointment, a constant burden to this family. The words slammed into me like a physical blow. Heat surged through my skin, and the sound of the room warped as though I were submerged underwater. Nervous chuckles, sly whispers, every word magnified until it hammered against my chest. She always drags them down. Remember that fiasco at the charity gala? Each cutting remark wrapped itself around me, pressing harder and harder until I thought I might collapse under their weight. Instinctively, my eyes sought my father. Richard Sterling sat tall at the head of the table, his face composed, lips pressed into a thin line. For one suspended second, I willed him to intervene to stop the cruelty, but instead his chin dipped, once slow and deliberate, an acknowledgement that cut deeper than Michael's insults. That nod told me more clearly than words ever could in his eyes. My brother spoke the truth. The betrayal seared through me. Not only from Michael, but from the man whose approval I had chased all my life. My father's silence, his small but damning gesture, pierced me more sharply than the mockery echoing through the room. I felt tears pushing at the back of my eyes, desperate to fall, but I refused to give them the satisfaction. Not here. Not now. If I broke in front of them, Michael would win, and the glint in his smirk would grow unbearable. I clenched my fists under the table nails, biting into my palms, and forced myself to raise my head. Our eyes met. For the first time in years, I didn't look away. Something shifted inside me, subtle, quiet, but unyielding. His words, my father's nod, The whispers curling through the room, they no longer felt like chains binding me. They were sparks igniting something buried far too long. In that silence, I told myself, I will not let him define me. I am not what he says I am. I will prove it not to him, not even to my father, but to myself. One day they will understand that dismissing me was their greatest mistake. The rest of the evening, blurred laughter and conversation washing over me like static, but the moment stayed sharp, etched into my chest. As I sat there beneath the glitter of chandeliers, something within me began to turn. It wasn't a loud, dramatic shift, but a steady one like a tide rolling in. The sting of Michael's words cut deep, but in their cut, they carved space for something else to grow. A seed of resolve, fragile yet unbreakable. And I knew this was the moment that would change everything. Michael Sterling's mocking laugh and my father's silent nod still echoed in my head as I walked out of that banquet hall later that night. They trailed me into the night air like ghosts, sharper than any blade. For a moment, the sting of humiliation threatened to drown me, but beneath it, something else began to rise. A fire. Not of anger alone, but of resolve. I drove back to my small apartment, headlights cutting through the empty Dallas streets. The farther I got from that glittering house, the clearer my thoughts became. By the time I reached home, I knew I was done letting their judgment dictate the story of my life. Inside, silence wrapped around me like a bomb. I kicked off my heels by the door, the sound of them hitting the hardwood echoing in the quiet. My apartment wasn't much, but it was mine. The desk in the corner still held stacks of notes and printouts, my laptop resting open in the middle. This was the place where I had built something no one in my family even suspected, something they could never imagine belonged to me. My mind slipped back, unspooling to 2018, the year I secretly planted the first seeds of MedLink. It had been born from watching too many people fall through the cracks of a broken system, their lives shattered not because of fate, but because of neglect. I poured myself into the idea night after night, typing until my fingers ached, sketching models until my eyes blurred. I pitched in coffee shops where no one looked up from their phones, stood in boardrooms where men chuckled as I spoke, collected rejection after rejection like stones in my pocket. Each dismissal weighed on me, but it also hardened me. With every no, I stitched together a layer of strength I didn't know I had. I sank into the chair by my desk, the warm glow of the lamp spilling across the papers. My phone buzzed. A message lit up the screen from Samantha, my closest friend, the only person who had known about MedLink since its fragile beginning. Her words glowed in the dark. "Congratulations, Em. The contracts are finalized. Summit Ventures is in. They believe in MedLink. You did it." My breath caught. My hands trembled as I read it, once then again, as though repetition would make it sink deeper into my bones. My chest tightened, but this time not from shame or hurt. It swelled with something sharp and bright. I whispered the words aloud, my voice shaking. They believe in MedLink. For years, Michael's voice had haunted me, telling me I was nothing, that I would never measure up. Tonight, those insults no longer cut the same way. They had not destroyed me. They had driven me here to this moment. Persistence, not failure, had defined me. On the desk, just beside my laptop, sat a small gift box. Teal paper wrapped it neatly, a silk ribbon tied in a careful bow. Samantha had given it to me days before, urging me to wait for the right moment to open it. I ran my fingertips along its smooth surface. Light as it was, it felt weighty in my hands, as if the future itself were folded inside. I didn't open it. Not yet. The ribbon held back more than paper. It held back the tide of emotions I knew would rush out when I finally lifted the lid. The box was more than a present. It was a marker, a quiet declaration that I had reached a turning point. I stared at it, my pulse quickening. This was no longer just about a company or a contract. This was about the truth, because soon I would have to place it before my family, before the father, who had nodded in silent agreement while Michael shamed me, before the brother who built his confidence by tearing me down, and watched their faces as their version of me unraveled. Still doubt whispered, Would my father's eyes finally soften when he saw what I had created, or would he dismiss me again the way he had all those years ago when my scholarship was handed to Michael, as though my victory didn't matter, and Michael himself, what would he do when he realized the sister he ridiculed had built something sturdier, more enduring than any of his glossy ventures? The teal box glowed faintly under the lamp, a small square of color against the cluttered desk. My breath quickened, as if the decision itself waited inside, pressing against the silk ribbon, begging to be revealed. This was my story now. And once I opened it, truly opened it, nothing in our family would ever be the same. I leaned back, closing my eyes. The echoes of laughter, whispers, my father's silent nod, they still pressed against me. But they no longer defined me. The fire did. My hand rested lightly on the ribbon, cool beneath my fingertips. In the quiet, I whispered to myself, steady and unshaken, "It's time." The next evening at Michael's house, the annual family gathering carried an air so tight it could snap at any moment. The mansion was warm and bright, filled with the hum of conversations and the clinking of glasses. But beneath the music and chatter, I could feel the tension sharp and unspoken in every glance that landed on me. I smiled politely, made small talk with relatives who never looked me fully in the eye, and ignored the whispers that curled in my wake like smoke. When the moment for exchanging gifts arrived, my chest tightened. My pulse beat heavy in my throat as I reached into my bag and drew out the small teal box. My palms were damp, the ribbon already slick beneath my fingertips. I held it out to Michael, who lounged near the fireplace, his glass balanced loosely in one hand, surrounded by his admirers. He took it with a spark of amusement flickering in his eyes. Not kindness, but something sharper, almost hungry. He snatched the box, without so much as a thank you. Turning it over in his fingers, he let out a laugh that cut across the room like a blade. "What is this supposed to be?" His voice rose loud enough to hush the chatter. Conversation stopped, forks hovered above plates. All eyes shifted to me. I didn't answer. I simply met his gaze, my faint smile the only shield I had left. Michael shook the box with exaggerated flourish, as though he were performing for an audience. The ribbon quivered with each movement. He grinned wide, cruel and theatrical. "Trash," he said, his tone dripping with contempt. Then, with a sudden flick of his wrist, he hurled it onto the table. The box struck the polished wood with a sharp crack, the sound slicing through the room like a whip. It bounced once, skidding against a wine glass that rattled violently before settling. A ripple went through the guests, a collective intake of breath, as if something sacred had just been defiled. A few cousins tittered nervously, unable to resist the performance. But then Aunt Susan leaned forward. Her smirk was deliberate, her eyes bright with malice. "Well, what did you expect?" she said, her voice pitched just enough to carry across the room. "Emily never brings anything worth keeping. Probably picked it up at a discount store on her way here." Laughter followed, sharper this time, scattering across the room like shards of broken glass. Each chuckle landed on me, hot and stinging, more cutting than the box hitting the table. Heat surged into my face, burning down into my chest. My hands twitched at my sides, my breath uneven. Instinctively, I turned toward my father. He sat rigid at the head of the room, his glass tilted toward his lips. He didn't speak. He didn't so much as glance at me. His silence was a verdict more brutal than Susan's words. My mother, seated a few chairs away, lowered her gaze to her lap. Her hands twisted together, restless, but she too remained silent. The quiet from my parents landed like stones in my stomach, heavier than the jeers. The humiliation pressed down on me until I thought my knees might give way. The room tilted, spinning with whispers and laughter, every sound amplified, distorted. I had been told my whole life that I was lesser, that I was expendable. And now it played out again, not behind closed doors, but in front of every relative, every guest, every set of eyes that had ever judged me. But then something shifted. Beneath the weight of shame, another force stirred, older, deeper, born from years of labor. No one had seen nights of silent tears and mornings where I rose anyway. My breath slowed, my fingers steadied. From the wreckage of that moment, a strength began to take shape. I reached down my hand, calm now, and picked up the teal box. The wrapping was dented, the ribbon slightly undone, but it lay firm in my palm, solid and undeniable. My fingertips traced the crumpled paper, and for the first time I saw it not as a cheap offering, not as an object of ridicule, but as a vessel. It held more than paper. It held my truth. I rose to my feet. The movement was small, quiet, yet it drew every eye. The chatter died. Forks froze mid-air. The laughter choked into silence. My heels clicked softly against the hardwood as I stepped into the center of the room, each sound steady and echoing louder than the laughter that had mocked me minutes before. The box, no larger than my hand, now felt monumental. The light from the chandelier caught the silk ribbon, making it shimmer as if it had absorbed the weight of every gaze. I held it out before me, my arms strong, unwavering. My eyes swept the room. I met Michael's mocking stare, my father's rigid expression, my mother's downcast eyes, and the curious, guilty, hungry stares of the rest. No one moved. I no longer trembled. The shame had fallen away. What filled me now was certainty, calm and unshakable, like steel cooled and hardened by fire. I held the box not as a victim clutching her wound, but as someone ready to open a door that could never be closed again. Michael's smirk faltered just slightly, but enough for me to see the flicker of unease behind his confidence. The teal box, once tossed aside like trash, had become the catalyst. It was time. The room was suddenly still, so still that I could hear the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway beyond the dining room. Forks clinked once against china and then went quiet. Every gaze was on me, a mixture of curiosity and disdain pressing down like a weight I had carried all my life. Michael froze, the crooked smile still fixed on his lips, but twitching, faltering. His eyes narrowed as if scrambling for a line he had forgotten. My father Richard finally looked up from his glass. For the first time that night, surprise flickered in his eyes, a small crack in the stone facade he wore so carefully. I steadied myself, inhaled deeply, and untied the ribbon on the small teal box. The same box that had been tossed aside now sat in my hands like a vessel of something far greater. The paper gave way beneath my fingers with a soft rip. As I lifted the lid, the silence deepened, every breath in the room drawn tight. Inside, instead of jewelry or a trinket easily dismissed, lay a stack of neatly bound documents. My hands closed firmly around the edges as I drew them out, the embossed seal from a California venture firm catching the chandelier's glow. Gasps rippled across the table. Chairs creaked as guests leaned forward. Murmurs flared and spread like a brush fire. "Is that real?" someone whispered. "I thought she was just drifting," another voice hissed. I raised the papers higher, letting the golden seal flash under the light. My voice steady but low cut through the room. "This is Medlink, my company, years of work, and today it became official." The words landed with weight. For once, mouths that had always been quick to laugh at me found no reply. Michael gave a short laugh, sharp but hollow. He shook his head, muttering under his breath. "A trick. It has to be." But the tremor in his voice betrayed him. His hands twitched at his sides, restless, and for the first time uncertainty edged into his eyes. I didn't need anyone's validation. The truth was written there in ink and signatures in the firm press of seals that no ridicule could erase. The teal box that he had sneered at now held something undeniable, something that demanded to be seen. I stood taller, a calm resolve flowing through me. The silence I had endured for years had not been a weakness. It had been a forge, and now its product gleamed in my hands. The room stirred with whispers, but none of them mattered. What mattered was that the shadow I had lived under no longer defined me. I looked at my father. His lips tightened, his gaze shifting uneasily between Michael and me. There was something there. Hesitation, maybe even regret. For once he had to face me not as an afterthought, but as the daughter who had built something on her own. Michael's fists clenched his shoulders, stiff, his face reddening with fury. I knew his impulse to tear the papers away, to crush them before they could rewrite the story he had always controlled. But the moment had already passed. The reveal was out, irreversible. Slowly, deliberately, I lowered the papers back into the teal box. The same box that had been thrown in contempt was now the container of truth. The silence that followed was no longer filled with ridicule, but with something heavier: disbelief, curiosity, and the dawning recognition that the Emily they thought they knew had been rewritten before their eyes. This was only the beginning. Even as the shock of the reveal still clung to the air in that banquet room, my mind slipped back to the nights when all of this had felt impossible. While Michael basked in praise and applause, I was in Houston scraping through long shifts and endless rejections, my hopes stretched thinner than my wallet. I remembered the smell of burnt coffee on my clothes after working back-to-back shifts at the diner and the bookstore. My shoes stuck to the floor from spilled soda, my hands raw from scrubbing tables. At night, I hunched over a borrowed desk in my one-bedroom apartment, the overhead light flickering as I typed proposal after proposal that no one seemed willing to read. Dinner was often nothing more than a packet of ramen with a few peas tossed, and sometimes just crackers and tea. I still hear the rain pounding against the window one night when I broke down on the phone with Samantha. She listened without interrupting, her voice steady when she finally spoke. "Emily, you are not failing. You're building something real, even if they can't see it yet." Her words anchored me when everything else felt like it was slipping away. And in time, her promise proved true. One night, her message flashed across my phone, simple but life-changing. "Summit Venture Partners is interested. They want to talk to you." I cried again, but this time it wasn't despair, it was released. All those nights of silence and grit had led to this. Proof that I wasn't just struggling, I was building. But with that hope came a shadow. Samantha confessed something she had kept from me, her voice cautious, reluctant. "Emily, there's something you need to know about Michael." She told me about 2019, the year Michael siphoned money from family funds meant for another project and funneled it into a flashy tech startup. He never told our father. When it collapsed within months, he buried the loss, the money gone without a trace. Samantha had been pulled in to clean up the paperwork, making sure the truth never reached beyond the family's walls. I gripped the phone so hard, my knuckles turned white. Suddenly his jeers, his constant belittling of Medlink as reckless and naive, made sense. It wasn't just arrogance, it was fear. Fear that one day his failure would surface. Fear that my success would expose the rot he had hidden. The anger that surged through me was sharp, bitter, but beneath it lay clarity. For years I thought I was running a race I could never win, always falling short of Michael. Now I saw the truth. His shadow was not cast by greatness. It was cast by deception. I never told anyone, not even my father. That secret was a blade I could unsheath at any time, but I knew its edge was double-sided. It could destroy Michael, yes, but it could also tear apart what little remained of our family. So I carried it silently, waiting. And now, standing in that glittering dining room with the teal box in my hands and whispers spinning like smoke around me, I caught the flicker of unease in Michael's eyes. His mask was cracking. He knew something had shifted beyond his control. He didn't know that I also carried his darkest failure ready to surface if I ever chose. That knowledge steadied me. For the first time, I understood I was no longer in his shadow. The past had been cruel, and it had shaped me into something he could never counterfeit. His envy, his lies, his downfall, they were his to bear, and I would not let them weigh me down again. The last echoes of whispers about Medlink had barely settled when Robert Hayes cleared his throat again. His voice was calm, but it carried a weight that immediately stilled the room. He had been my father's lawyer for decades, and when he spoke, people listened. I watched as he lifted another folder older and heavier than the one I had revealed. The leather cover was worn, the edges frayed as though it had been handled many times before. My breath caught as he spoke. "There is another document I have been entrusted with. It concerns the future of the Sterling family and its legacy." My father shifted in his chair, his hand tightening around his glass. Michael's head snapped toward Hayes, his expression twisting from shock into something darker, something close to panic. The lawyer unfolded the papers with deliberate care. This is the last will and testament of Richard Sterling, signed in the year 2021 and verified under state law. According to this document, upon his passing, the majority of his estate and controlling shares of Sterling Enterprises will be transferred to Emily Sterling. The words fell like thunder in that lavish room. Gasps rippled through the crowd. I saw Karen's painted smile vanish. Her hand trembled as she clutched her clutch bag tighter, her eyes darting between me and Michael with a calculation that made my stomach twist. It was the look of a woman measuring loss in real time, as though her world had been rewritten in a single sentence. Michael shot up from his chair, his voice cracking as he shouted, "This is a lie! A forgery! Emily doesn't deserve any of it. She has no right." His fist slammed against the table, rattling glasses and silverware. The defiance was loud, but beneath it I heard the tremor, the hollow echo of fear. Robert Hayes remained unshaken. He held up the page where my father's signature sprawled in dark ink. "This is Richard's handwriting, original and notarized. I was witness to its signing. It is authentic." For a heartbeat I thought I saw my father's composure falter. His jaw clenched, his brows furrowed as his gaze fixed on Michael. It wasn't the gaze of a proud father anymore. It was heavy searching, touched with something that looked like suspicion, maybe even disappointment. The weight of years pressed against me. I remembered how Michael's voice had sliced through the air earlier that night, calling me a failure, a disgrace. I remembered the smirks, the whispers, the pitying glances. And now, here in front of all of them, the truth of who I was and who I had become stood undeniable. I kept silent, letting the documents speak for me. Truth did not need embellishment. But inside, a storm raged. I thought of the secret Samantha had shared with me about Michael's failed investment, the one he had buried deep. That truth still slept in my hands, a sharper weapon than any inheritance. Michael's protests continued, his words stumbling now, spilling out in desperation. "She tricked you, Dad. She's manipulating everyone." But the shift in the room was palpable. Eyes that had once judged me now turned toward him, questioning, measuring. His voice no longer commanded the room. It only exposed his fear. Karen leaned back from him, her face pale, her lips pressed into a thin line of contempt. Richard sat rigid, staring at his son as though searching for answers to a question he had avoided asking too long. I drew in a steady breath. My hands no longer shook. For years I had been their afterthought, their silent shadow. Tonight the silence was broken. As Hayes closed the folder and set it carefully on the table, the air in the room felt charged like the edge of a storm. My fingers brushed against the teal box still resting on the table near me. I thought of how one secret had already shifted everything, and now another truth had cracked the ground beneath Michael's feet. The legacy of my family was not his by default. It was mine, not because of ink on paper, but because of the years of unseen labor and unyielding resolve. The will was proof, but my life had already been the testament. And as the silence pressed down on all of us, I knew nothing would ever be the same again. Michael lunged forward, his hands outstretched toward Robert Hayes, spitting accusations as if sheer volume could erase ink from paper. His face was flushed scarlet, his voice cracking words tangled between rage and desperation. Robert stepped back calmly, the will pressed firmly against his chest, while Samantha moved swiftly to his side. From her leather folder she produced another copy, its crisp edges gleaming beneath the chandelier's light. Her voice was steady, unflinching. "This is certified. There is no denying it, Michael." The air thickened, heavy enough to choke on. My pulse thudded against my throat, but I grounded myself in the truth that no one could strip from me. My voice, when it finally came, was quiet, but razor sharp, slicing through the noise. "You stole my place all my life. You mocked me, belittled me, and tried to crush me into silence. But not anymore." Michael spun toward me, teeth-bared fury etched into every line of his face. For a moment, it seemed he would lash out with the venom he had stored for decades. But before the words could leave his mouth, movement cut across the room. Helen Sterling. She had always been a shadow, gentle compliant, her voice buried under years of her husband's dominance and her son's bravado. Yet now she stepped forward. Her eyes glistened. Her hands trembled, but her spine was straighter than I had ever seen. "Enough, Michael." Her voice wavered at first, but it carried a resonance years in the making. The room fell silent, every head swiveling toward the woman who had rarely spoken above a murmur. "I have watched you trample over your sister year after year, because you feared she might outshine you. I stayed silent, hoping you would change. That silence was my mistake." The gasp that rippled through the room was soft but undeniable. Guests leaned forward, their disbelief mirrored in wide eyes and parted lips. Helen Sterling, the ever-loyal mother, the quiet wife, had broken her silence, her words slicing through the years of family mythology that had crowned Michael untouchable. Her gaze fixed on him, sorrow heavy in her eyes, but steel anchoring her voice. "You cannot call yourself strong by tearing Emily down. Not anymore." Michael's face drained of color, his jaw slack as though she had struck him physically. For once there was no clever retort, no rehearsed smirk to cloak himself in. His arrogance faltered, collapsing beneath the weight of his mother's rebuke. I watched the room shift. Richard's gaze darkened heavy and conflicted, torn between paternal loyalty and the truth he could no longer deny. Karen's eyes narrowed, her lips pressed into a thin line of contempt, the distance between her and Michael widening by the second. Robert Hayes remained steady, papers in hand, the law embodied in flesh. And Helen, fragile, trembling, Helen stood like a pillar that had always been there, but never before revealed its strength. For me, it was not triumph that welled up, but release. The moment cracked something open, not just in Michael, but in the narrative that had bound me in silence for decades. The hush that followed was not the familiar silence of dismissal, the kind that erased me from view. This silence held weight, recognition, the dawning realization that I had been here all along. And for the first time, I was not invisible. The air was heavy, thick with all the words that had been spoken, and the ones still locked inside. Just as Helen Sterling's trembling voice faded, my father rose slowly from his chair. The scrape of wood against marble echoed through the room, pulling every gaze to him. He had sat in silence all evening, watching, weighing, and now his voice carried the weight of judgment. "Emily." His tone was low, husky with age, yet steady. "I have been wrong." His eyes, dark and weary, met mine, with something I had never seen before, guilt. I favored Michael all these years. I believed he would be the one to carry on this family, to lead with strength. I blinded myself to his flaws, to his arrogance, and because of that, I failed you. The words struck deeper than any insult Michael had ever hurled at me. My father, Richard Sterling, had never admitted fault, not once in my 34 years. My chest tightened. My throat burned as though the silence of decades was unraveling in a single moment. For so long I had longed to hear him say he was proud of me. Instead, he confessed regret, and somehow that pierced even more sharply. But then his gaze hardened, shifting back to me, his voice taking on the stern weight I had known since childhood. "Yet you too kept secrets. You hid your struggles, your work, Medlink. You shut us out as though we were strangers. If you had trusted me sooner, if you had shared your burden, perhaps we would not be standing here now, a family divided." A ripple of whispers moved through the room. The sting of his words sank deep, not because they were untrue, but because they laid bare something I had never wanted to admit. My silence, born of fear and survival, had built walls too thick for anyone to see through. A part of me wanted to shout that they had left me no choice. But another part knew the truth: my father was right. My secrets had protected me, but they had also deepened the fractures in our family. He turned then slowly to face Michael. His shoulders squared, his jaw clenched, and for the first time I saw no warmth in his eyes. "Michael, I gave you everything. My trust, my name, my company. I ignored every warning sign, every mistake, because I wanted to believe in you. His voice grew heavier, each word falling like a gavel. "But tonight, you have left me with nothing but disappointment." Michael's mouth opened, but no sound came. His face twitched, blotches of red spreading across his skin. Karen shifted uneasily beside him, her lips pressed thin, her eyes betraying nothing but contempt. My father's voice cut again, sharper, final. "I will not shield you any more. The law will handle what remains. I cannot and will not place the future of this family in your hands." The silence that followed was suffocating. His words had been more than judgment, they were a sentence, a closing of doors that could never be reopened. For years, Michael had been the chosen one, the pride of our family, untouchable. And now, with a single decision, my father had stripped it all away. Then came the words that chilled me most. "From this day forward, I cannot trust you, Michael." They lingered in the air like smoke, impossible to clear, heavy and irreversible. Michael's shoulders sagged as though a weight had finally crushed him. His eyes darted desperately around the room, searching for someone, anyone to defend him. But no one moved. Not Karen, not my mother, not the guests who had once applauded his every word. My father lowered himself back into his chair, his hands gripping the armrests as though the act of sitting carried the full burden of his years. His face was drawn, carved with the cost of what he had just spoken. I stood motionless. A storm of sorrow and vindication raged inside me, colliding in ways I could not untangle. For years I had dreamed of his recognition. I had prayed that one day he would see me not as an afterthought, but as his daughter with worth of her own. And now that recognition had come entwined with the ruin of my brother. The room remained hushed, the kind of silence that follows truths too heavy to bear. The guests sat frozen, no longer spectators of scandal, but witnesses to the fracture of a family whose pride had once seemed unshakable. And in that silence, I knew that nothing in our lives would ever return to what it had been before. When my father's words finally cut through the air, stripping Michael of the favoritism he had clung to all his life, I felt a weight slide from my shoulders. Medlink, the will, the years of silence, they had all converged into this moment of truth. Yet fate was not finished. Karma, it seemed, had been waiting just beyond the door, and now it stepped forward without hesitation. Richard Sterling Hayes held the will steady in his hand, but his eyes shifted toward Michael with a measured calm that carried more force than shouting ever could. "There is one more matter that cannot remain hidden," he said. "It concerns Lone Star Realty." The name of the family's company alone sent a murmur through the guests. I saw Michael stiffen his body tense, as though he had been struck. Karen's hand darted to his sleeve, her nails pressing into the fabric, her whisper sharp enough to cut. "Don't let him speak." But Richard had already opened another folder. His tone remained professional, even cool, but every word landed like a hammer. "There is documented evidence of falsified accounting records at Lone Star Realty. Transfers into private accounts, concealed revenue. Michael, these actions are not only unethical, they are criminals." Gasps rippled through the room. Some guests shook their heads in disbelief, others exchanged looks of vindication, as if their suspicions had just been confirmed. A couple even chuckled softly, the sound slicing through the silence like a knife. It was not laughter or humor. It was the laughter reserved for a man revealed as a fraud. Michael's face was drained of color. He pushed back from his chair, the legs scraping against polished marble with a screech that made everyone flinch. His hand reached for his glass, but it slipped from his grip. Red wine spilled across the white linen, rushing like blood across the table, dripping down his sleeve. The stain spread quickly, dark and irreversible, like a mark he could never wash away. The sight was almost surreal. For years he had polished his image until it gleamed untouchable and flawless. And now, before the very eyes that once adored him, his mask dissolved in crimson blotches. I thought of the small teal box that had once been thrown aside, only to return as a vessel of truth. The spilled wine felt like its mirror, a brutal, messy unveiling of what had always been hidden. Karen rose abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. Her eyes, once soft with devotion, were sharp with disgust. She didn't say a word to him. She didn't need to. The way she pulled her shawl tighter and walked out without looking back was louder than any accusation could have been. Michael stumbled back into his seat, his chest heaving, his eyes wide and unfocused. His lips moved, muttering fragments of excuses, but the words broke apart before they reached anyone's ears. The room that had once been his stage was now a courtroom, and every gaze upon him was a verdict. I watched him not with triumph, but with a quiet, aching sorrow. This was my brother, the boy I had once followed through sunlit yards, the boy who used to race me to the oak tree, now reduced to a figure trembling in the wreckage of his own deceit. He had sown greed and cruelty, and tonight the harvest had finally come. Around us, the murmurs grew louder. Some shook their heads, others whispered of police, of courts, of ruined reputations. Each word was another nail sealing the coffin of the man Michael had pretended to be. I felt my chest rise and fall with a steady calm. Not joy, not vengeance, only release. The truth was no longer hidden, and with it the chains that had bound me for so long dissolved. I turned to my father, who sat rigid and grim, and then to my mother, whose eyes glistened with tears she could no longer contain. Samantha met my gaze from across the room, her expression firm but tender, a silent reminder that I had weathered the storm. Karma had arrived swift and unyielding, and though it had broken Michael, it had also set me free. For years I imagined myself standing in a room full of the very people who dismissed me, raising my voice, hurling back every cruel word they had ever thrown my way. I thought that shouting would be the only thing strong enough to heal the wounds their contempt had carved into me. But when the moment came when Michael slumped in his chair, stripped of everything he once wielded, I realized I didn't need to shout at all. His ruin spoke louder than anything I could say. Karen's quiet exit shattered their fragile marriage more effectively than a public fight ever could. My father's confession of favoritism and his final break with the son he had once protected echoed more powerfully than any speech I might have made. My silence was not a weakness, it was strength. The room that had once buzzed with laughter and mockery was now hushed not with disdain but with awe. Their eyes no longer sliced into me with judgment. They studied me with something closer to respect, maybe even remorse. For the first time, the silence that wrapped around me did not isolate me. It lifted me. I stepped away from the table, away from the chaos that had unraveled within those walls. My heels clicked softly against the polished floor as I carried myself toward the doors. I passed the spilled wine, the toppled chair, Michael's pale face buried in his trembling hands, and I felt no need to stop. The night air greeted me as I stepped outside. The Dallas sky stretched wide and dark, sequined with stars. The cool breeze brushed against my skin, loosening the tightness in my chest. I breathed deeply, the crisp air filling me in a way I hadn't felt in years. On the bench by the garden, I sat down and looked at the small box in my hands. That same teal box, the one Michael had once sneered at and tossed aside, still carried the weight of everything that had happened. It had begun as a symbol of my humiliation of the moment I was meant to be diminished. Tonight it became something else entirely. It was the vessel that revealed my truth, that exposed the lies that turned silence into strength. I traced the ribbon with my fingertips, remembering the trembling in my hands when I first picked it up from the floor. That was the moment everything shifted. My voice had been hidden inside this little box all along, waiting to be opened. I lifted my gaze toward the sky, a faint smile tugging at my lips. I knew life ahead would not suddenly be easy. There would still be struggles, losses, and moments when the old wounds would rise again, reminding me of their scars. But I no longer feared them. I had unearthed a resilience I didn't know I carried, and I had learned to honor myself even in silence. For so long I believed that to be heard, I had to fight for attention, for approval. Tonight I understood something different. True strength comes from knowing who you are even when the world refuses to see it. It comes from standing in the wreckage of lies, holding on to your truth without needing to prove it with noise. The stars above shimmered brighter as I pressed the little teal box against my chest. My beginning and my ending bound together in one small square of paper and ribbon. And I knew as I rose from that bench that I was no longer the invisible woman in the corner. I was the one who had opened the box, and with it, I had opened myself to a life unbound. And perhaps this is what I wish others would know: you are not defined by those who diminish you. Walk away from what wounds you, no matter whose voice carries the blade. Family may shape your beginnings, but it cannot decide your worth. That belongs only to you. So I ask you now, if the truth of your own life were revealed, if the silence you've carried for years were finally broken, would you choose anger or would you choose